Kathleen Burton has taught in the French department at Yale University since 2007. She has a PhD in theology from Laval University in Quebec, an MA in French from Central Connecticut State University, and a BA in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. She has studied at the Sorbonne in Paris and at the Institut d'études Politiques de Bordeaux.
And I want to really thank CCSU. It's wonderful to come back and to be able to see the campus and to be able to speak here in the bookstore. And it's my first stop on my speaking tour. And what means the most to me is because this book has been 20 years in the making, over 20 years in the making. And it all started right here at CCSU. When I was studying in Caen for a summer program, I went to a bookstore in Caen and I picked up this book, which is called Paul Tillich's Writings Against the Nazis, where he talks about the 10 theses against the Nazis. And I sat there in the corner of that bookstore, and I think they were wondering, what is that woman doing over there? Okay, because that started my whole journey on this over 20-year publication journey. My book itself and its contents are very well described just by the title itself. It's broken into two untold but very necessary to be told stories. The cover itself is a stained glass window in Worms Cathedral in 2017, was installed there in Germany as a series of atonement stained glass. And so you'll notice that you have a Nazi stormtrooper who is oppressing a Jewish man. You have the Star of David, and then of course you have it going into the French flag. But this is an actual stained glass window in Worms Cathedral, and very recently installed, by the way. But what I want to do is also talk to you then about the two parts of the book, about the Nazi religion. This is the first untold story. It's a piece of propaganda from Adolf Hitler that is still active and alive today, because people don't know about the Nazi religion. And so, therefore, you can still see propaganda being propagated by that. And also, you have the Nazi religion and understanding, and I'll go more into this in the book, is that the Nazi Party was founded in 1920 amongst many other parties in the Weimar Republic after the First World War in Munich. They held up their 25 points and they say, oh, well, if you believe in these 25 points, please join our party. Well, the 24th point of the Nazi Party program of 1920 is, we believe in positive Christianity. So in the first part of the book, we're going to talk about what is the Nazi religion of positive Christianity. And on the second part of the book, who understood what was positive Christianity of the Nazi religion. And that's where we talk about the rise of the French Christian resistance. And because of the extraordinary men who were able to understand this, who brought the victory over it, and where the victory wasn't brought, in Germany, we're able to highlight that the French Christian resistance were indirectly responsible for 3/4 of the French Jews surviving the war. The highest rate of Jewish survival in Europe besides Denmark. So those are the two parts that are very well delineated right there in the title itself. I am a very ambitious author. This book, as I said, has been over 20 years in the making, and it's been written for a general educated public. It was first published in French by the L'Université Laval, and it was much more a theological book, and it was much more targeted to an academic community. But that is one reason why it's taken so long, is that I want to reach the general educated public in this country, Canada, France, and England, for this kind of important information to be able to give us a better understanding of this still very enigmatic, what is this Nazi Germany? This element, this puzzle piece has not been explored. And so this is the beginnings that I'm doing here. And so my expertise is in being able to connect the dots. And that's what I do in this book. So what will you discover in my book? Okay, making the unknown known and making the unclear clear in 3 parts with an afterword, which is a little bit of an unusual afterword, actually. In part 1, the Nazi religion hiding in plain sight. All right, as I said, they said in their actual program, we believe in positive Christianity. So this is not Dr. Burton projecting onto the Nazi movement that, oh, they were indeed a Nazi. No, This is in 1920 at the founding of the party. They said, no, this is what we believe. Okay, so what is it? Okay, this begs the question, what is positive Christianity? What isn't it? Is there a negative Christianity since there's a positive Christianity? So these questions I address in chapter 1, straight away, straight up at the beginning, so that you can have a clear understanding. I will give you a couple of hints about positive Christianity, because as a group, if we start to think about the Bible and how the Bible is constructed, we know that the Old Testament is the history of what people? The Jewish people. Well, with those 25 points that the Nazis held up, extremely anti-Semitic, as you know. Extremely anti-Semitic. So what about the Old Testament? Is that included in positive Christianity? What about the New Testament? A lot of it was written by St. Paul, also a Jew. Is this a problem for positive Christianity? Well, indeed, of course, it's a very big problem for the Aryan race and the supremacy of the Aryan race in Nazi Germany as they were founding their 1,000-year Reich. And so this is where we start in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we talk about the myth of the 20th century, a very obscure book that will no longer be obscure after I finish my speaking tour. The myth of the 20th century. This book, when I went to find it in the vast research libraries at Yale University, there was one copy, and it was a photocopy. But the myth of the 20th century, a very central book in understanding what was meant in this 24th point of the 25 program points of the Nazi Party of positive Christianity. It was written with the distinct importance of bringing that to the fore and understanding it in order to educate the Hitler Youth and every member of the Nazi Party post-1933 when the Nazis were in power. So the title, The Myth of the 20th Century. This book was commissioned by Hitler in 1930, before they came to power, written by Alfred Rosenberg. Who's Alfred Rosenberg? He's not a Jew, obviously. In the inner circle of Hitler, he's not going to have anyone from the Jewish race involved. But in Germany, you will find it very interesting to know that in Germany, there are many people that are called Rosenberg and Rosen who are not Jewish. And that's sort of an Americanization of things, and I wanted to point that out. But the book was commissioned in 1930, and it came out in 1934, 1 year after Hitler democratically was elected into the Reichstag and Chancellor in Germany. It was published in 1934, 150,000 copies at the first printing of this book. By 1936, 2 years later, you have 500,000 copies of this book. By the end of the Second World War, 1 million copies of this book. What are they doing with all of these copies of this book? Well, it's important to know that Alfred Rosenberg was not just important for the publishing of this book, but he was extremely important in the Nazi Party and in the Nazi government during the 1930s. He was hung in Nuremberg, in the Nuremberg trials after the war. But he was in charge of, he was the Minister of Education. So what was he using his book for? To educate the Hitler Youth. He was also the spiritual and intellectual leader of the Nazi Party appointed by Hitler in 1933. So he had the important role of educating the membership of the Nazi Party and the Hitler Youth. That's where all these books were going. Interesting enough, Christopher Dodd, who was the ambassador to the American ambassador to Nazi Germany at the time, you might have heard of, Eric Larkin's In the Garden of the Beasts, and he talks a lot about Dodd. And Dodd also is giving the high sign to America, saying, this is not your normal dictatorship. He wasn't a dictator at all, as a matter of fact, because they were elected, right? But this is a very, very different scenario within Nazi Germany, how it's affecting especially the educational realms and the political realms. So this is the myth of the 20th century. Also, I talk about his role. I wanted to highlight that Alfred Rosenberg also had the role of the editor of the Nazi newspaper. He was the head of the Nazi Party when Hitler was in prison in 1923. He was also, after the war, the Reich leader for the expansion into the Eastern territories to be able to make all of the room for the Aryan peoples. And he also headed the pillaging of Western art throughout Europe. Why? Because the myth of the 20th century has chapters on art and what is German art and what is not German art. And it also has chapters about the expansion into the Eastern Territories. So you can see the correlation between the positions he held and the book that he wrote. So that's all in chapter 2. We talk more about the myth of the 20th century. In chapter 3, Rosenberg himself. Who was he? Where he was born? He was born in what is now Tallinn, Estonia, of a German family amongst many German peoples that were in that part of the influence of Russia. He went to Moscow in architecture, and then when there was the Bolshevik Revolution, he went to Munich and joined the Nazi Party, and then he began his career with Hitler. The myth itself is related to Mein Kampf. Now, of course, all of us have heard about Mein Kampf, right? This is Hitler's book, written in 2 parts when he was in prison in 1923. This book, The Myth of the 20th Century, these 2 books together are to be found in many of the cornerstones of the buildings that Hitler built during the Third Reich. And as a matter of fact, 4 different independent sources put them in the cornerstone of the Congress Hall in Nuremberg at the party rally sites, which is another thing I'll speak about at the end when I wrap things up. But Mein Kampf itself has religious references. Who knew? Well, you've got to read it, which I did. And with the religious references in Mein Kampf, they parallel the religious exactitudes of positive Christianity in the myth. So the 2 counteract one another as this sort of cornerstone of this 1,000-year Reich of how they're going to be able to solidify and change the Aryan race and the Aryan population within Germany. Chapter 5 then talks about who knew about this. I discuss a group called the Friends of Europe out of London, an extraordinary group, 72 volumes written during the 1930s before the war. Who were reading these volumes? These were ministers, prominent ministers in America that were publishing. These were prominent Episcopal ministers in England. This is Winston Churchill, Albert Einstein, all published in these 72 volumes. Who was reading them? And trying to find the research on that, I'll come back to in the afterword. But they definitely understood that the Nazi power from 1933 on was a very different animal. In part 2, we talk about the duping of Christianity. How did Hitler's propaganda dupe Christianity in the cradle of what would be called academic theological Germany at the time? And that's very important because it still exists today as far as understanding positive Christianity, or not understanding it, or not even knowing that the Nazis had a religious element, a powerful one. We start by talking about the Roman Catholic Church. All right? Germany's a Protestant country, but Austria wasn't, and Austria was annexed. And the Roman Catholic Church had a very strong infiltration between the wars into Germany and into Nazi Germany, and they were very interested in being able to expand their influence. They had universities, they had newspapers, they had books being published within Protestant Germany. They signed a concordant, which for the Vatican is a treaty, with Nazi Germany in 1933. And after signing that concordant, basically Hitler turned the tables and interpreted every single aspect of that treaty in his favor and basically tied the wrists of the Roman Catholic Church during the period of the Third Reich and during the period of the Second World War. This is a big problem for France. France was 98% French, 100% French and 98% Catholic. All right, so a very Catholic country. So the influence there I talk about also in part 2 on this whole duping of Christianity, because Hitler needed the Christian churches to support him to get elected, but he didn't want them to understand what was the undercurrent of what positive Christianity was going to be, negating the Old Testament, negating Paul's epistles, making Jesus an Aryan, not even a Jew. This all had to be clandestine and very covered up as much as possible because they needed their support at the beginning. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 bring forward the weak Christian shield, what was happening within Germany in the theological spheres. You have Paul Tillich, very famous theologian who was exiled in 32 and began a whole other American Tillich, if you will, at Union Theological Seminary. But in Germany, he wrote, and this was the book that I found in Caen, way back when I was studying here at CCSU, he wrote the 10 Theses Against the Nazis. He was a chaplain in the trenches in the First World War. He saw the debauchery, he saw the depravity of man, and he was very engaged with religious socialism, and so he confronted the Nazis on their level. In other words, he confronted them with their own program. He confronted them in positive Christianity. He went to the essence of what it was with amazing idea of the Kairos moment where God was working with us in history. Right here, we can fight this together. Versus Karl Barth, who was the other very famous theologian in Germany, although he was Swiss. He was exiled to Switzerland. But he was Christocentric, very centered on the Bible and on Jesus. And God was not involved in the history. That was us. And very involved with the group called, and very confrontive, not of the Nazis themselves. And this is where Tillich and Barth could not come to terms. And it brought forth a very weak shield against this onslaught of positive Christianity, because Karl Barth wanted to address the German Christians. Who are the German Christians? Well, it's not the Christians in Germany. It's not Christians in Germany. It's the German Christian movement. The German Christian movement, it's thanks to them that the Nazis were ever able to be elected in the Reichstag. Because at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you had this German Christian movement where I explain it much more in my book, but let me synopsize it by saying, maybe when we became Christians so long ago, we gave up a lot of our Aryanness, a lot of our Germanness, a lot of our German culture. So you had this fight for supremacy. What is it? Is it the Christian faith or the German culture? And this was the beginnings of the German Christian movement that pushed the Nazis into power in the 1930s. So I talk about that in chapter 6 and chapter 7, those two theologians who unfortunately could not hold up the shield, could not come to terms together, could not rally the Protestant country of Germany. And so what happens is it's 1939, the torch gets passed to France. And this is part 3, which is the rise of the Christian resistance in France. The torch gets passed to France in 1939. France in 1939. What a mess. You have all of the refugees coming up from France fleeing Franco. That's why you have camps in the south of France, because they were built for those fleeing Franco. All right? Thousands, tens of thousands. From the east, you have tens of thousands of Jews fleeing Germany, Poland, right? All of the countries from the east flowing into liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? So France was inundated by refugees coming in. And I talk about that and the situation of France at that time, and even about actually, I don't bring up the Evian Conference in my book, but I'll talk about that later, the Evian Conference of 1938. But what I wanted to talk and continue about in part 3 is France in 1940. Okay, the capitulation, France has to capitulate to Nazi Germany, and then France is divided into 7 pieces. France is cut up, never before since the 15th century, when Joan of Arc was in France, was France at the point of being wiped off the actual map of Europe. It was completely cut up into 7 different zones. Philippe Pétain, who was the chef d'État nominated by Hitler in the occupied zone, and what you had there, because if we look back to the Roman Catholic Church in 1933 signing this concordant with Hitler, so with Philippe Pétain, in occupied France, you had all of the representatives of the Roman Catholic Church, all there. So what happens is in France, a Catholic country, it comes down from the cardinals to the archbishops and to the bishops and to the priests. We have to toe the Pétain line, all right? Collaborationist line. And this gives birth to the French Christian resistance because Pierre Chaillet, Gaston Fessard, André de Lubac are Jesuit priests. They not only have to turn from their own Jesuit order, but they have to turn from their own Catholic church in order to be able to lead the resistance. And the resistance is extraordinary, and part 3 talks all about this. It talks about the near escapes from the Nazis when they're publishing the underground newspaper, The Christian Witness, that's Catholic and Protestant together. What? In France, Catholics and Protestants together? There were wars of course, the wars of religion that you've all heard of, just massacring, right? So here we have then an ecumenical underground newspaper that's putting the pressure on the archbishoprics in France to hide the Jews. This is how 3/4 of the French Jews survived the war. So my afterword was, what still needs to be done? That's kind of unusual for an afterword, but 20 years have gone into this book. I said, okay, well, you have to draw the line somewhere, right, Catherine? So, researching the Friends of Europe, recognition for Pierre Chaillet by the Roman Catholic Church and by France, he's still unknown. The Nazi buildings and the cornerstones, we have to open them up and show the importance of the myth of the 20th century. New discoveries, Alfred Rosenberg's book, Alfred Rosenberg's personal diary, is found in 2013. Where is it found? Wilmington, Delaware. Wilmington, Delaware, by the Homeland Security, because people stole things after the war, right? During the Nuremberg period, right? People, it's going to be worth a lot of money someday, right? They find it there, and he was only one of the 3 inner circles of Hitler's inner circle to actually keep a personal diary, found and published by the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum in 2015. So this is extraordinary new discovery. And finally, I just wanted to say that me, as the ambitious get the book known, I really, really want to thank CCSU for having me, because I could start my whole speaking tour going here. And with over 75 years since the end of the Nazi regime, Second World War, we still have this enigma where we don't completely understand. This is a missing puzzle piece that is essential to understand Nazi Germany. The result of the tragic occupation of France, the Holocaust, the travesty of the Second World War. In the end, we need the whole picture. And this is an important part. And my expertise is connecting the dots. So that's what I do. And I just wanted to say that, here's to the truth seekers. May you be one too. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Kathleen.
You're welcome.
Questions for Kathleen?
If 2/3 of the French Jews survived,
3/4.
3/4, sorry.
That's all right.
Why were so many deported?
Very good question, actually. You have many of the trains that were leaving France, of course, and from onto the concentration camps. But what you had was all of these Jews that were coming into France, right? All pouring into France in the 30s. There were over 240,000 Jews, refugees in France. And so France raised the white flag, said, we need help, please, we need help. So the United States sponsors and pays for the Conférence d'Évian, Évian Conference 1938. 32 countries come and represented. How are we going to help France? Not one single country helped France, ours included. Actually, one country stood up and offered to take 10,000 Jews, the Dominican Republic. Yes, and they ended up taking about 1,000. My husband had one of the grandchildren of one of those people that went to the Dominican Republic in his course in chemistry. But, okay, so a total fiasco of Évian. It was an unbelievable propaganda coup for Hitler. See, you don't want them either, right? Such a travesty. Thank you for that question. Anyone else? Yeah, Catherine.
There's so many thank you so much for
my
great
pleasure.
presentation. I can't wait to find this book, and I have a friend in Berlin who really would like
Oh,
it.
thank
She's, like,
you.
deep in
Definitely.
I was thinking, and particularly you even used the phrasing of how much resonance this has as a lesson for contemporary concerns and current events. So Sarah Kendzior is doing a lot of podcasts and writing a book called Hiding in Plain Sight. And so this notion of a Christo-fascist movement in the United States that is gaining steam and also is kind of camouflaging. I didn't know if this was something that interested you. I mean, obviously the history is in itself just brilliant and really important, but I was just thinking there's a good lesson here that might be relevant to other these hidden religious movements. That was really fascinating.
Absolutely. And thanks for adding that, because it's very true. It's very, very true, and very poignant example, because people tend to throw around that word Nazi way too much, and that really bothers me. Thank you. Thank you for that comment, and I certainly hope so. I'm really trying to get my speaking engagements. I'll be at the Alliance Française in March here in Hartford. Anyway, doing more of those. Yes, Gail.
Talk a little bit about the, so this is this is an adaptation or an adaptation of the first book?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it is. An updating, a translation, over more research. Of course, the book was published in French in 2006, so this hadn't even been found yet. His personal diary wasn't even found till 2013. It wasn't even translated and published until 2015, right? Also, the first book in French was written for my doctorate. It was my doctoral dissertation. So much more theologically focused, obviously. Now, I've tried, and I had wonderful readers, one of which is here, Lois, who helped me talk me down from the ledge of theological verbiage, because I want the general educated public to know about even if they can't articulate what it is, positive Christianity, they will be convinced by what's in the book that there was a religious aspect to the Nazi Party view of a 1,000-year Reich. And that's what's really important, yes.
It is fascinating that, talking about these two esteemed theologians.
Yes.
Right? And having a disagreement on a theological level, and therefore not being able to come together in a very practical way.
Exactly.
To stop.
Exactly. And it's heartbreaking when you think about it, because they were both Tillich was very influenced by the hands-on, everyday, in the trenches World War I, right? Karl Barth didn't have that experience. And so he had a very gut-wrenching, very in-your-face death every day by the multitudes experience. And that really guided him in his religious socialism. Karl Barth was also a religious socialist, but in 1919 he left religious socialism in a very not-so-nice way. And so he alienated a lot of his colleagues, but he turned around. Karl Barth turned around and he finally says, oh my gosh, this isn't about the German Christians, this is about the Nazis themselves. And Paul Tillich writes this amazing article in the publication called Christendom. And he said, Karl Barth's turning point. Wasn't that great? A little late, but anyway, at least he understands that this is Nazism itself, not the German Christians. So it's not an inter-Christian issue. But by then, of course, the Nazis were in power already. And the unbelievable eradication, what they did to academics like ourselves, right? They emptied many of the universities, many of the high school level teachers, because they wanted to be able to start as quickly as possible to indoctrinate with the whole. So Christopher Dodd, what he was trying to bring across to America, this is not your typical situation. Even Winston Churchill, that's why he said that we will fight and we will fight and we will fight, because this is the undermining of Western Christian civilization. So there was a comprehension there, but there's anyway, read the book. Please.
Thank you very much, Kath.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you so very much. Oh, and these, you're welcome to take these flyers. I think the bookstore has a few books available if you'd like to purchase them, but you can take the flyer and use the special offer code. For reduction is right here on the flyer. So if you can't get the book today, please help yourself to a flyer. Thank you so much. And please write to me via Gil. Maybe they could write, Gil, you could forward them on my email. If you have a place that you would like me to speak about this, I'd be happy to come. It's my quest. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.